Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cold War Spaces. I'm Anna Rose Canzano, the Exhibition and Programming Associate at the Wende. Thanks so much for tuning in today. And we're so happy to welcome Sudha Rajagopalan as our guest today. She's Senior Lecturer in East European Studies at the University of Amsterdam. She also teaches in the Media Studies and History departments. She's a historian and cultural studies scholar working on Soviet and Russian popular culture. Her current project, which we'll be discussing today, is a study of the semiotic and affective journeys of Soviet objects outside of Eastern Europe, such as books, gadgets, photographs, and other such artifacts that made their way to India, Germany, Italy, and Cuba. And you saw a selection of those images at the start today. She's also worked on media convergence and cross-medial cultures. And in 2010, she published the book, Indian Films in Soviet Cinemas, The Culture of Movie-Going After Stalin. And she also co-edits the international peer-reviewed journal, Digital Icons, Studies in Russian, Eurasian, and Central European New Media. So today's discussion will be about a 30-minute conversation between Sudha and Segal, the Wende's Chief Curator and Director of Programming. And after that, we leave about 15 minutes for the audience Q&A. So please put your questions in the Q&A box during that time. And don't put your questions in the chat because Yus will be reading the questions from the Q&A. But in the chat, if you'd like to say what city you're tuning in from and say hi, it's always nice to see. And please make sure to switch the blue box to panelists and attendees so that everyone can see your messages. We'll be posting the recording of today's program on our Vimeo page afterwards, and also in podcast format on our SoundCloud. And lastly, I'd like to thank Susan Horwitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting discussion series at the Wende and our virtual programs. And now Yus will get us started. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna Rose. And Sudha, welcome to Cold War Spaces. Great to have you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's lovely being here.
Let me start with a personal question. So Soviet objects in Cuba and India sounds like a peculiar research topic. Can you tell us how you got involved with it and why you decided for these two countries? And actually also Germany and Italy, but you are now focusing on India and Cuba. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Yus. Thank you, Anna Rose, also for the introduction. One of the reasons that I was interested in this project, and I still am, luckily, is the fact that from my own personal experience in India, growing up in India, I was very conscious of the fact that there's this kind of dissonance, or if not a dissonance, not a perfect consonance between having things from other countries and also articulating ideas about them, right? So I knew that, for instance, in India, many of us have grown up with Soviet books, but certainly the Indian middle class has also always nurtured ambitions and aspirations to study in England or in America. So the fact that you could have these two parallel worlds to which you had exposure and which you never saw as being in any sense contradictory went against the grain of everything that I subsequently had to study about the Cold War when I came to America and I did my PhD. So it seemed like the kind of binary vision of the world that we are taught in traditional Cold War history didn't seem to correspond to anything that I had experienced growing up in India. So later on, and I've done many things, but over the years, I have kind of nurtured this interest in objects because I'm curious about how objects find a place in our homes, but we don't always think through let's say why or how they made the journey that they did and what they were perhaps supposed to represent, and if at all they have come to represent those very things. So it was this kind of, let's say, tension between what we have and what we're supposed to imagine about where they come from that I was interested in. India and Cuba, because, well, India, because I have experience with it. And so I was aware of these tensions and contradictions. And Cuba, because I was interested as part of a larger interest in the global South. Mm-hmm. And we talked about this the other day. I'm very, very kind of, let's say, motivated and engaged with the idea of doing a Cold War history where the global South is not acted upon, you know, but where we are, in fact, in the global South, actors, agents of our own history. And this is also true of Cold War history, where not only were things sent from the Soviet Union to many of these countries, but these countries also exerted a fair amount of influence on the Soviet Union and also did different things with the Soviet objects that they received. Now, why Cuba and India? Politically speaking, they're both exceptional in many ways. India has always been, let's say, lots of people who would still complain that it's much too socialist. So it's always had a fairly socialist political culture. But but in the Soviet official discourse, it's always been was considered a bourgeois democracy. So we kind of straddled two worlds of being socialist, but then democratic, a political democracy, and non-aligned. We were aligned with neither the US nor the USSR, yet we had very close relationships with the Soviet Union and also subsequently with America, more so with the Soviet Union. Cuba, because even though it was socialist, the socialist revolution was not brought about with the help of the Red Army and the Soviet state. So it was a kind of pleasant surprise for the Soviet Union to have this little socialist experiment in the Americas. And also the Cubans have always had a very strong sense of being distinctive from the Soviets. So in a sense, they were part of this bloc, perhaps in the Soviet imagination, but in their own worldview, they were very distinctive and very, very much part of the subcontinent or the continent that they were part of, and very distinctive from the Soviet Union. So for those reasons, I chose these two countries. And
Great. Yeah, so we will talk more about the appropriation of objects in India and Cuba. But first I want to ask you, because you mentioned the word geopolitics in the title of your research, what do you think was the original intention from the Soviet Union to make it possible for these objects to travel to countries like India and Cuba?
Yes, well, if I'm sure many in the audience might be familiar with the history of the Soviet Union after the 1950s, certainly after the death of Stalin, where you have this kind of reassertion of an internationalism, where the Soviet Union is once again looking to make friends, allies, and also is interested in peaceful coexistence, as Khrushchev called it. At the same time in the world, you have two interesting developments. One is, of course, decolonization. And the fact that so many countries were now independent, including India, after 1947, and were thus seen as a kind of terrain or a site where these two superpowers of this emerging Cold War could play out their battle of ideologies, right? So these were these countries where they could find, hopefully, they could find sympathetic publics. In Cuba, of course, in 1959, there is the revolution, there's the withdrawal of US patronage and support, and there is the revolution, which comes to be called a socialist revolution subsequently, right? So you have these two events in 47 and 59 in India and Cuba, and in between these two events, you have this, let's say, you might say a coming out of the Soviet Union to the world, saying, hey, look, we're not the bad guys here, and we're interested in peaceful coexistence, and we're, and you have a spate of festivals and all kinds of cultural programs. So it's this confluence of historical events that I think make the geopolitics of that moment very interesting. And so what the Soviet Union seeks to do at this point is to reach as many countries as possible and cultivate circles of sympathizers in these countries. Of course, they had been doing this in India from the time that the British were there, but they step up their efforts after Stalin's death. And America is doing the same thing. So you have, by the end of the 50s, both of them sending out their movies, their books, and objects through other ways, So you have an interesting kind of competitiveness in this area.
Right, and where would you say was the emphasis in the Soviet Union? Was it on sharing socialist values, or was it more on making the point that the Soviet Union is a good partner because it is anti-imperialist and a good friend for the developing countries in the third world?
Yes, well, all of that, really. I mean, and the fact that, it could claim to be this anti-imperialist nation, right? Because we were supposed to see the Soviet Union as organically multicultural and multi-ethnic. And so it could say that, well, look, we are this superpower or this contesting power that has a very different history. We do not have a history of exploiting others. Look at all the Central Asians in our our multi-ethnic union. We're all, beautifully integrated, seamlessly integrated. So this is what we have to offer to all of you as a model nation, plus the fact that the Soviet Union offered and continues to offer, I'm sure for many people in their imagination, a model of how a state could modernize at a breakneck speed, could transform an economy that was primarily agrarian into a highly industrialized nation that won the Second World War. So there were so many lessons that newly independent nations felt that they could learn. So there was that, there was the socialist kind of ethos of access for all and a non-exploitative economic order. And there was this kind of logic of anti-imperialism that they believed was central to the, being a communist state.
Right. So both in Cuba and in India, Soviet objects and Western objects lived side by side. Of course, in Cuba, the Soviet objects only entered after the revolution. But can you tell us or give us an insight what people in both countries, India and Cuba, thought made Soviet objects peculiar and stand out? And did they value that as something positive or rather negative or both?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a huge question, right? Yes, because I mean, I look at so many objects, I look at souvenirs, I look at books, I look at appliances. So there is not only a very great variety of objects, these are also objects that are all, in a sense, they have all been acquired in vastly different ways, which also makes a difference. So to, in a sense, to take your question apart a bit and just look at one thing, right? If I look at Soviet appliances in Cuba, for instance, right? As you rightly said, what I found so fascinating when I was there was the fact that one living room can have a Soviet sewing machine and a General Electric fridge from before the revolution, right? And so this is the beauty of looking at objects as a prism for understanding how geopolitics actually played out in everyday life. Because if you look at the rhetoric of geopolitics, then you would imagine that these are two completely mutually exclusive kind of ideological worlds, right? And they simply cannot meet. They simply cannot cohabit a space. But if you look at the Cuban living room, you see the Singer sewing machine, you see the General Electric fridge, you see the Soviet blender. And so you have this sense of this kind of cohabitation, as I call it, of these appliances. So what makes the Soviet one stand out in this is primarily what we would call in contemporary discourse, sustainability, right? So it's very interesting that they all use this word. I mean, so at the time they might have complained that these things were, simply, and they do say that some of these Soviet appliances look like trucks, I mean, they're supposed to be household appliances, but they look like, tanks and trucks. And they mean that to, or they say that to suggest that these are unbreakable, they last forever. And now, of course, because these interviews happen in the present, they use a kind of contemporary parlance to say, well, this is sustainable, right? So they talk about, primarily with Soviet appliances in Cuba, they talk about access and sustainability. And the interesting thing about these interviews is that they frame the acquisition of a Soviet washing machine or a blender or something else in this kind of transformative moment from before the revolution to after. So if I ask them about their first washing machine that came from the Soviet Union, they will first tell me about how they had access to nothing in the pre-revolutionary days when American goods were available, but only for the wealthy Cuban elite. And what the revolution made possible and subsequent Soviet support was the fact that these appliances were now accessible for everyone. So there is that on the Cuban side. But if I were to take a Soviet book in India, for instance, right? There's a different logic to what makes the Soviet book stand out. Indians grew up with Soviet books, Indian books in various languages, English books, American literature, all of this, right? So then you ask an average Indian reader what made the Soviet book stand out. They will tell you, many of them told me, it was, and Soviet children's books were the most popular in India. They would say that this wasn't infantilizing literature. these were children who had real lives, you know. Their parents worked, they went to factories. I mean, they had shortages, you know, they worked hard. And you read English literature, and, you know, girls went to boarding schools. They got packages to have midnight feasts, all of which was wonderful. But, you know, we didn't do that. I mean, I grew up reading this stuff. I didn't know what roasting chestnuts in a fire was, but I always grew up reading it and I imagined it must be lovely. But then you read the Soviet children's book and you had the parents who were working, and you had hardships, and you had travel, and then you had children saving money. So it felt more real. It felt less infantilizing.
Right.
And some of my interlocutors told me that they felt that Soviet children's books prepared them for the world better than did Anglo-American literature.
Yeah, it was closer to their own experience. Interesting, yeah.
Yeah.
And can you tell us, I mean, it's so useful that you make those differentiations about different kinds of objects. I'm also very curious about souvenirs, because that seems to be another category of itself.
Yes, souvenirs are really interesting. Perhaps I should step back a bit and first say, in terms of methods of or processes of acquisition, right? Appliances in Cuba came through formal trade. Soviet books in India came through from formal trade. Soviet appliances in India did not come through formal trade because India did not allow the import of foreign appliances, because the focus was on developing the domestic industry. So if I find Soviet appliances in India, they usually were acquired on the flea market, or simply people couldn't remember where they came from. So they're always treated as oddities. Now, the souvenirs are different because they're couched and they're framed in stories that are very personal. So often Cubans and Indians would tell me about how they were beneficiaries of this wonderful Soviet program to invite thousands of students from around the world, primarily the global south, to come and study in their universities, right? I was one of the last students to go after the Soviet Union collapsed. So my certificate of that scholarship also says the USSR, actually. So
Right.
so many of us were beneficiaries of this program in the global south. And so a lot of these souvenirs were collected in these contexts of let's say, traveling to the Soviet Union, learning about it, and they're often couched in stories of personal relationships, of friendships, intimacies. You know, the supervisor, the PhD supervisor who was so incredibly kind. So the interesting thing about souvenirs like the jail porcelain, the matryoshki, the nesting dolls, and all of those, is that they're all framed in stories of geosociality, which I think is a very interesting and underexplored plane of geopolitics. Because friendship is boring, I don't know why. Maybe because it's not adversarial, I have no idea.
Right.
But, you know, marriage, friendship, pen pals, these are the kinds of stories that souvenirs are framed in. And I think
Right.
that offers an interesting kind of perspective on the way geopolitics is realized in everyday life.
Interesting, yeah. I'm also very curious, and you mentioned that already a little bit. Of course, there are cultural differences between the Soviet Union on the one hand and then India and Cuba. And does that also translate itself or work? Does that also work out in the way some objects were used or appropriated in ways that was never intended in the Soviet context?
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. I mean, I did expect that they would be, or maybe I was hoping that they would be. But there is some semiotic appropriation, right? So their meanings become different. So if perhaps they were expected to, in a sense, stand out and represent this, let's say, impeccable system of modernization, they didn't do that, right? Because my Soviet and Indian interlocutors would talk about well, how accessible and wonderful and durable these things were. But, you know, none of them bought into this narrative of the Soviet system of modernization being necessarily better, because all of them had access to other things. All of them were also aware of these intersecting discourses of American and other kinds of European modernization. So you might say that there is an appropriation in terms of their meanings and their significance being somewhat diminished in the context of the local, right? But there is also another kind of appropriation, particularly in Cuba, where there were many more appliances, for instance, right? I saw lovely examples of a Soviet record player with, or an American record player predating the revolution with a Soviet needle, right? And a Japanese amplifier. So,
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
there are all these wonderful ways. And they also say they do that with the Lada as well, right? They say that car is supreme, the Soviet Lada, they say. And they still, they kind of, tinkle with it and they change its engine. So they do appropriate it now in many ways. But if we're talking about the Cold War days, then it would be this kind of thing where they would attach parts of other appliances that were still working. So it's interesting because where if you look at the rhetoric of geopolitics, these would seem to be mutually, let's say, illegible or incompatible worlds. In that one record player, you see them actually mutually, in a sense, enhance each other's functions. So I really love that kind of example.
Right.
I'm not sure if I answered your question. What was your question exactly about?
No, you did
Appropriate.
answer it.
Yeah.
So it was about the appropriation
Yes.
and different use of objects in
Yes.
India and Cuba. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I would say then with the appropriation, again, the semiotic appropriation with Soviet books in India, which is, of course, the primary Soviet artifact in India, I would say that, I mean, the fact that they were able to so comfortably, sit in a bookshelf with all of these others, right? And participate in this epistemic world that was just much more than just that, that one ideological kind of, let's say, vocabulary. I think that is what Indians did with it. They kind of allowed it to, they adapted it and allowed it to rest comfortably with literature from everywhere else and didn't see
Right.
any contradiction in this.
Right. So you already mentioned at the very start of this interview that the bipolar model, the East versus West model of the Cold War, doesn't really work so well when you look closer at developing countries, the global South, etc. So that also makes me curious what you can say about the flow of cultural artifacts the other way around. For instance, I know that you have been studying the reception of Indian films in the Soviet Union. So what went the other way around and how was Indian culture and how were Indian objects received in the Soviet Union?
Yeah, I mean, Indian cinema was the most popular foreign film in the Soviet Union. They weren't the American films. They were Indian films that were the most popular. And the interesting thing about that, there's been a decade since I did that research, but it keeps coming back. Is that a lot of people would tell me that in those years, especially the Thaw years and later, so you're talking the first Indian film arrived in Moscow in 1954. So in the 50s and then later in the subsequent decades, that these movies, in a sense, felt like they resonated a great deal with the Soviet audience, right? So then they would give me various reasons for this. One of this was, and this was a standard explanation, was that they would talk about how there seemed to be this correspondence between the Slavic soul and the Indian soul. I'm not saying there is, I'm just saying this is how they interpreted it. And they would say this meant that, for instance, in the movies, Indians were more given to entanglements, which interestingly is also one of the things that my Indian readers said about Soviet books. They would say there were always many people in every book. And so Indians it's hard not to be familiar and acquainted with many people in India. So this was something that the Soviets also said about Indian films, that there seems to be all these emotional entanglements, that community is very important. And always, a hero in an Indian film was always someone who wasn't given to material pursuits. So in many ways, this kind of fit in with their idea of what was considered to be, let's say, important, perhaps even Russian values, pre-revolutionary, but also post-revolutionary values. So there were Indian movies, and then because of Indian movies, a host of other things, Indian literature, yoga by the 1960s, 70s was big. So many things, yes.
Great. We are almost moving to the Q&A, but I want to ask you one last question before we do that.
Mm-hmm.
Your research is in large part based, as you already mentioned, on interviews. And I wondered what you could say about how you think memory works in these interviews, given the fact that there is this historical distance now. People are aware that in 1991, the Soviet Union fell apart. How did that color or impact their narratives, their stories about their own past?
Yes, absolutely. Excellent question. Thank you. Yes, I mean, these are in a sense object interviews, but the object interviews become parts of larger interviews that you might call almost life story interviews. And what is interesting is that both in India and Cuba, many of these stories of the journeys of these objects are framed in the context of what both countries believe that they have lost to some extent. So, for instance, in India, it is the loss of, let's say, a time in which people believe we were more inclined to being, let's say, uh, a socialist society. We were never officially that, but I mean, we were after the 1970s, but that's a long story. But in many ways, in the last 20 years in India, we've seen an upsurge in neoliberalism, and a lot of these narratives about Soviet objects are framed in terms of a loss of this period in which our values were different, right? Where a time where not only was the Soviet Union a friend, but we seemed to understand where our political priorities must lie. And all of that is changing very rapidly in India. So particularly in this context of rapid political transformations and this kind of shift of an ethos from a very socialist one to one that's much more, given to, let's say, liberalization and privatization and all of that, and a great deal of Americanization. A lot of my interlocutors remember this as a period, a kind of regime, a moral regime that was superior, Similarly with Cuba, where of course they're still communist, but what they do there is, of course, they talk about a loss of these values again, like a time when, we had fewer choices, but at least, we had our priorities right. We had one thing and we made it last forever, right? But then there's also another story in Cuba, and that is an understanding that a lot of them gave me that now, for instance, there was one family in which there was an old Soviet washing machine, the Aurica. It was in their backyard, and it was completely weathered down and looked rusty and completely unusable. They hadn't thrown it away because they were very attached to it. And in their home, they had this new Taiwanese one, I think. And I remember that they talked about how, while the Soviet one represented a time in which they had a true friend who stood by them despite the American embargo, in their home now, they had a sign of what was actually more realistic and more feasible for Cuba, and that was to have multiple allies and multiple trading partners, and that they put too many eggs in one basket when they were reliant on the Soviet Union, because when the Soviet Union collapsed, they faced the most dismal 1990s when they ran out of everything. So in both of these stories, you do have that framing of a loss of some sort of regime of values.
Very interesting. Thank you. We are moving to a Q&A now. So if you have questions, please put them under the Q&A box. And there are already a lot of them. So let me start. The first one is by Jacqueline Loss, and she writes, "Hello, thanks so much for this fascinating comparative research. I'm writing to you from New York City. You have mentioned that Cubans saw themselves as part of their continent as opposed to part of the Eastern Axis. I know how interesting and important it is to speak about general comparative trends, but could you speak about that more in terms of distinct periods and in terms of which Cubans and when? At what points would you say they saw themselves as either or both Caribbeans and Latin Americans?"
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Jacqueline. It's nice to meet you this way. We were in touch once. The sense of distinctiveness that my Cuban interlocutors talked about was mostly with those who had, let's say, memories of living in Cuba in the 30s, 40s, and would then talk about how they would always talk about this landmark speech that Jacqueline, of course, obviously knows about, in which Fidel Castro calls on them to, to come forward and study Russian, for instance, right? So a whole host of my interlocutors remembered wanting to study Russian in the early 1960s because of this. And so they would always talk about how they did things because he asked them to. And it was not so much that the Soviets particularly meant anything to them. After all, they had also been exposed to a great deal of propaganda against the Soviet Union before that. But it was this fact that Castro meant so much to them, and the fact that the revolution called out to them. So I think that mostly it was my older interlocutors who did this, who talked about this distinctiveness. And about the Caribbean and South American, that came up much less in my interviews, except perhaps when talking about the current period and talking about Putin's relationship with Cuba, so that was the only time that it came up. But largely it was the kind of national pride they felt about Castro himself. So they would tell me stories about how when they went in the 1960s to the Soviet Union, people would accost them on the streets and call out his name and that kind of thing. And of course, we know about the kind of impression they made on Soviet popular culture at the time.
Right, thank you. The next question is from Antonio Cardentai. I hope I pronounced that correctly. He writes, there were many Soviet exhibitions of technology and culture around the world. In Cuba, we had two, one in the early 60s and another one in the late 70s. Were there any similar exhibits in India? And if so, how was people's reception to these exhibitions?
Well, that's the interesting thing. There weren't any because the Soviets didn't export formally any appliances, any technologies to India. They did set up steel plants in India. But other than that, there wasn't any formal trade. So the interesting thing is also that with India and Cuba is also that there is an absence of a kind of discursive framework, right? There is no talk about Soviet technology in India during these years. And so when these appliances also enter Indian homes, they're always an oddity, I mean, people would talk about how neighbors would come and have a look at it because they wondered what it was, they'd never seen anything like it. So we didn't have these in India at the time. And I also came across a very interesting fact, and that is by the 1980s, in fact, the Soviets were importing consumer goods from India. So what was happening was that India's domestic industry, consumer goods industry had developed by the 80s, and our consumer goods had used parts that were imported from Germany and France, for instance. So the Soviets were actually importing consumer goods from us in the 1980s. I don't know about distribution beyond that, but this was an interesting kind of reversal of fortunes by the 1980s.
Next question is from Robin de Bruin. He writes, Sudha, you said that you are primarily interested in the agency of people in the countries in the global south. How did this research change your views on the idea of competing globalizations, meaning Americanization versus red globalization?
Yes, I mean, Robin, hi, and thanks for coming. Well, I mean, it didn't, in a sense, it just reinforced what I already believed, right? Which was that the actual lived experience of the Cold War is much more complicated. And in a sense, you might think that these are self-evident truths. And they are. But the problem is that when we produce Cold War histories of the global South, the Soviet Union and the global South, we're still talking in terms of a kind of one-way street, right? And I think what was also... So what it reinforced for me was really the possibility of what I call eclectic solidarities, right? The fact that both Indians and Cubans would talk about, even when the Cubans express gratitude almost in a kind of formulaic way, right? I mean, to the Soviet Union and say, well, they helped us when no one else did. That there is always, it never felt to me in the interviews like it was to the exclusion of other kinds of felt affinities or solidarities. And of course, this is, I mean, this is intuitively, I mean, the way it has to be. And it's the same with India, where, the felt affinities with the Soviet Union were never at the, sort of to the exclusion of other kinds of affinities and solidarities. So in that sense, I mean, I would say, Robin, that it rightly complicates the story. And, it talks, I'd like to talk about alternative cosmopolitanisms where also Indians are aware of Cuba and Cubans were very aware of India and that kind of thing. So there's also these other dynamics to this
Yeah,
period. Also, can I quickly
Sure, go ahead. Yeah.
The fact that one of the things that happened also in my Indian interviews was the fact that no one ever referred to the Cold War. I mean, as a cognitive narrative framework, it appeared to be non-existent. I would use it, but they wouldn't. And I thought that was very interesting because their view of the world was simply not quite so binary.
Right, thank you. Yeah. Then we have a question from Benjamin Brown. Hi, Sudha. What were the most peculiar or interesting Soviet objects you discovered in Cuba and India? And how did these objects travel to Cuba and India? Were they simply exports or second-hand discarded items that were donated?
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, so many. Let me think. What was the most interesting, peculiar one in Cuba? It's hard to say. There were so many. Let me start with the Indian one. A record player that was that a person had found in a very small town in the state of Andhra Pradesh. She couldn't remember where her father had bought the record player. She did remember that there were Soviet sailors in the dock. This was Vizag or Vishakhapatnam in South India. And so she said that perhaps one of them handed this over to her father or sold it to him. And I remember the story. It's not so much that it was peculiar, but that it felt peculiar to them, was that they couldn't read the Cyrillic on it. And so they had to literally press all of the buttons on it in order to understand what its functions were, right? So what would happen when they press this or that? Everything was a trial and error kind of method. And that was also an interesting story because she had no idea where it had come from. And many of the stories in India are like this. People simply can't recall where they found something or if it was given or, it's just so curious the way these objects found their ways into Indian homes. In Cuba, it's hard to say what was the most peculiar one, I mean, I loved the story of the Aurica washing machine simply because it just lies there in the backyard. And but there were so many really interesting ones, I mean, the Soviet Selena radio, which I had in my apartment, which still works fantastically, but which was acquired as a reward at work. Another very interesting story was that of a Soviet radio, again, that was awarded to a journalist, and his wife sent it to him because he was covering the war in Angola. So, there's lots of these little journeys within these stories as well.
Right, thanks. Next question is from Charles Chu. To what extent does the memory of Indian-Soviet cooperation as embodied in these objects directly inform the opposition today to Hindutva domestically and to American efforts to enlist India into a new Cold War against China, for instance, through the Quad?
Yes. Well, I mean, I think we might slightly differ in opinion about what the purpose of the Quad is. I mean, I understand that it's read implicitly as something that's adversarial towards China, but absolutely.
Can you maybe briefly explain what it is? Because I don't think...
The Quad is the America, Japan, Australia, and India in this new kind of quadrilateral alliance, which the Chinese and the Russians see as being primarily adversarial towards China. So the Russians are kind of unhappy that Indians are part of this. But yes, I mean, when I was talking about how memories of this relationship are framed in the context of today's politics, it's very much in the context of Hindutva, of course, which is a particularly ethno-nationalist idea, but the neoliberalization that accompanies it, right? So the intense corporatization of our culture, and so of the cultural industry as well. So it is definitely framed in that context and as a kind of oppositional lens on this particular political development in India, right? And the fact that, for instance, a lot of my interlocutors in India would say that it's a pity that our children don't grow up with Soviet stories, because Soviet stories taught you, correct values and right values. And right now, our exposure to American and other popular culture is so greater than it was during the Cold War, that I'm afraid that they're losing out now on what we had. So this was a wealth of our childhood that is now lost to the current generation, the younger generation. So it's very much framed in the context of an opposition to that.
Right, thank you. Then we have a question from Yolanda Rodriguez Perez.
Thanks.
And she writes, you said that Soviet books were the main product consumed in India. What about Soviet books in Cuba? Did they play any role at all? How were they interpreted?
Yes.
Also, and then she adds, also similarities in line of that Soviet Indian souls, recognizable elements such as a lot of people, no materialistic society, etc. So she asked about reception there. But yeah, what was the role of Soviet books in Cuba?
I mean, Soviet books were, of course, translated in Cuba. But the interesting thing is, because I wanted to talk about those objects that my interviewees themselves thought were significant to talk about. And I would ask them about Soviet books. I had one interviewee who showed me a dining table full of political philosophy, Soviet political philosophy books that he had. But a lot of them would tell me that they didn't take to this literature. They did to Soviet children's animation, which was on television, right? So that was something that they all grew up with and they all remember fondly. But when I asked about children's books, they would say, yes, there might have been some that were translated, but none of them particularly articulated any significant kind of literature that they were exposed to at the time. So it was more a question of what they chose to talk about. I'm sure there were in their lives, but they didn't dwell on them.
Okay, thanks.
And what was the second part of her question? Yolanda's question was?
No, I think you covered it. So it was, yeah, she just added the projected values. I don't have the question anymore in front of me, but she gave some examples of the reception of books in India and asked if they were read in the same way in Cuba.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in the few interviews that some of my interviewees dwelt occasionally on literature, they would talk about how Soviet cinema had some sort of resonance and some varieties of Soviet literature, but never in the way that the Indians did, in the sense of always having some sort of Soviet book in the house, even when they didn't acquire it themselves. Also, the interesting thing is how much effort the Soviets put into translating these books into all of the languages of the world, right? So in India also, what made a difference was the fact that they were more accessible for those who didn't speak English, who didn't read English, because these Soviet books were translated into practically all Indian languages, as we saw in the slideshow at the very beginning.
Right, right. So Sudha, we are almost at the time, but we still have a series of questions. Let's do two final questions, and I'm asking you to keep your replies as short and concise as possible. The first is by Hans Rindisbacher. He writes, thank you for the presentation. Is there any kind of nostalgia associated with the objects you discussed? And for the objects, or rather for atmospheres, values, etc., that may have accrued around these objects in the framework of your comments on memory, also political nostalgia.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, this is kind of what I referred to earlier, right? So I wouldn't exactly call it, I mean, there is some nostalgia, but it isn't the most prevalent emotion in any of the interviews, right? There is a great deal of pragmatism in the kinds of stories that I get in Cuba, for instance, where they talk about how it's important now for Cuba to be friends and trade with many more countries, and they were over reliant on the Soviet Union. But there is in both places, a sense of these books or these artifacts representing or a time in their lives, right? And some of that nostalgia may also be for, one's youth, one's childhood. So it isn't necessarily always a political nostalgia.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And then the last question by Anniko Imre. She says, it seems that most of these Soviet objects left behind positive emotions. If that is the case, this would contrast with the negative feelings associated with Soviet consumer goods and other objects in Eastern Europe, where they were seen as faulty, backward, propagandistic, or just kitschy. Can you comment on that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the interesting thing about Annika's question is the fact that none of my interlocutors actually, when they talk about these things, want to dwell very much on the materiality of this, right? Because they're very dismissive of it. These things, they didn't look great. They lasted forever, but one didn't necessarily want them to always last forever, right? So there is a little bit of that, dismissive tone when they talk about the materiality of these things, the very ways in which they're kind of read in the East Bloc. So the positive attributes really, and the interesting thing about the objects is that it becomes less and less about the materiality of it and more about the emotions that are associated with a certain with that certain relationship, with a certain period in their history. So, I mean, the thing itself ceases to be important after a while. And what is more important for them to remember is this time in which, well, for the Cubans, for instance, the fact that the Soviet Union was such an epitome of solidarity, right? The fact that there was this great friend, the fact that when no one else wanted to be their friend, the Soviet Union did. The same way with Indians, there is a kind of almost an affectionate tone in the way they speak about these things. So they're dismissive of its quality, but it's kind of that odd little curiosity that reminds them of a certain time, in their family history. But so it is, and that's why I don't use the word nostalgia even in my work, because I see very little of that, and because that has so many other associations which I simply didn't come across
Right.
beyond what I said about the loss of a moral kind of regime.
Great. Well, Sudha, I want to thank you so much for a very lively and informative presentation. It was wonderful to have you.
Thank you. It was wonderful. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you to everyone.
So next week, we continue the Cold War Spaces series with German historian and Soviet specialist Karl Schlegel. And we will talk with him about his new book, The Scent of Empire, Chanel No. 5 and Red Moscow. Hope you can join me next week, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.